What's up, heathens? How ya doing? Today we're going to be talking about Frank Turek. Recently, he put up a video talking about how atheists have the burden of proof. Let's take a look and see what he's going to be talking about.
Now, atheists lately have been saying, I just lack a belief in God, so I have no burden of proof. Well, this water bottle lacks a belief in God, but we don't call it an atheist, right?
Well, Frank, I would say that you first have to have the ability to have beliefs in order to lack a belief in something. Otherwise, you can just apply any label to any object. We could also say that that particular object is non-Christian. We could say that water bottle is an agnostic on the question of God. So you can apply any label that you want to with it, including, atheist, as far as it being just a lack of belief. But also, atheists do not actually hold the burden of proof because we are not making a positive claim. That's what we're going to go over today. So if you're interested in learning how Frank Turek is wrong about the burden of proof, then please stay tuned. Now, before we get into Frank's video today, I do want to clear up some things about the burden of proof. Now, like I said before, atheists do not hold a burden of proof on the God question in general. We are not the ones making a positive claim. Atheists that are hard atheists or Gnostic atheists would have a burden of proof to prove that no gods exist at all. Where atheists do have a burden of proof is when theists, Christians or Muslims, make a positive claim about reality, like some argument that God exists or some argument that Jesus is the Son of God or that Jesus resurrected. Then, in order for us to say, well, no, that's not true, we do need to show them, or at least prove to them, that their argument is insufficient to explain reality or even their claim. Now, this proof that they are wrong could simply be pointing out that they do not have enough evidence to support such a claim, or that their evidence isn't really evidence, or that they just simply haven't made a logical or coherent argument for whatever idea they're pushing. All right, so let's get into Frank's video.
So I've had a question. A lot of times when people discuss about God, does he exist or not, there's often, I hear a lot of times on both sides about the burden of proof. Yeah. Who has the burden of proof?
So, who has the burden of proof? Well, anybody making a positive claim about some aspect of reality or something that's happened in history, those people shoulder the burden of proof. So like Christianity claiming that they know that God exists or they have evidence that Jesus is the Son of God and that he resurrected, they have the burden of proof to prove that Jesus resurrected. Atheists do not have the burden of proof to prove that Jesus definitely didn't resurrect, because the inherent default position here is that these things didn't happen. You have to prove that they did happen. Just like with God existing. If you say that God exists, you have to prove that God does exist. The knowledge or belief that God exists is not inherent to you when you're born. You're a clean slate. You have to convince somebody that doesn't know about God, never heard about a God. You have to convince them that a God does exist. He doesn't just exist by default. And this is where the apologists start off at. They think that God exists by default, and therefore the atheists have to prove that God does not exist. But that's not actually how it works. So let's see what Frank has to say to this guy.
Excellent question. What I say, I used to debate, like years ago I debated Christopher Hitchens. The first debate was, does God exist? I don't debate that way anymore because it sounds like I have the burden of proof completely.
Oh, could that be because Christians do shoulder the burden of proof? Not just Christians, but really anybody that's asserting that a God does in fact exist.
The way I debate now is I ask, in the second debate with Hitchens went this way: what better explains reality, theism or atheism? Or we could say God or no God, right? Yes. Then both sides have the burden of proof to explain how this universe is the way it is and why reality is the way it is from either a God perspective or an atheist perspective.
Well, so I don't really think that the atheist holds the burden of proof on that particular part. I still think that you hold that particular burden of proof because you still have to support and explain why God is a better explanation than just reality, like just nature. Reality just being here without any kind of supernatural intervention. And the fact that we have no recorded or documented suspension of the natural order of reality would seem to indicate that God has no hand in this universe. So the very best that you could do is suggest that some ambiguous supernatural deity exists outside of reality that we can't test for or touch. I know I can't refute that particular idea, but I don't believe that idea to be representative of reality. But just because, like, we don't know exactly what happened at the beginning of the universe, or we don't know how life began, or anything like that, just because we don't know doesn't mean that God must have done it. This is basically a God of the gaps argument that he's probably going to be going into here. Because the way that Frank sees it is that if the atheist doesn't know how certain things happened, like exactly, he doesn't have an answer for it, then his answer must trump the I don't know answer. But that's simply not how things work. You, Frank, still have to support your arguments, and they still have to make sense in reality, and they just simply don't.
Everybody, if they're a thinker, has the burden of proof to explain reality the way it is. Now, atheists lately have been saying, I just lack a belief in God, so I have no burden of proof. Well, this water bottle lacks a belief in God, but we don't call it an atheist, right?
This is stupid. I've heard this so many times, but like I said before, you can just apply any kind of label to something like that. Like, I don't believe in a God. This cup right here doesn't believe in a God. My microphones, they don't believe in a God either. But in order to have that label of atheist and that definition of atheist have actual meaning, the object that you're applying that label to has to have the ability of having beliefs. I feel like the lack of belief position has to come with being exposed to the belief. So, like, I wouldn't say that some random tribe in the Amazon that's never heard of God or the Christian God or anything like that, I would not call them atheist. I would call them secular because they're non-religious in the way that we understand it. They could have their own religions, of course, but let's assume for this hypothetical example that they don't have a religion. I would consider them to be secular, not atheist. So your whole grandstanding here with this water bottle just really makes you look a bit childish.
Yeah.
And so what I say to them is, I look at people who are interested in these issues as like detectives. If you're a detective and you're a Christian, and I'm an atheist, and I'm a detective in this scenario, and we come across a dead body, and you say, you look at the clues and you go, I think suspect X is the murderer. And I say to you, Joshua, I lack a belief it's suspect X. You're then going to ask what? Well, who do you think the suspect is? The true murderer. And if I say, well, I don't have to have a suspect, I just lack a belief your guy is the suspect. Am I a good detective?
No, sir.
No, I have a burden of proof too to say I think suspect Y is the murderer. And here's the evidence I have for that.
This would be the worst detective on the planet right here. Frank Turek is the worst fucking detective ever if he thinks this is what makes a good detective. For one thing, your whole scenario here would explain why so many innocent people get locked up in the United States. I mean, it's so prevalent that there are specific groups out there that work to free innocent people from the justice system. So I feel like you're highlighting the bad detective work that does go on in reality. Because, Frank, just because you have an idea of who the suspect is does not automatically make you correct. And just because the other person does not know who the suspect could be or has even an inkling of who might have committed the crime, just because they don't know does not mean that you are automatically correct. And it seems like with this hypothetical murder scene that you've made up, it's just like with your whole God belief. You feel that your position that you're asserting is automatically the default and correct position until somebody else can definitively come up with a specific enough answer so that your God can't hide in the gaps anymore. I don't know is a perfectly reasonable response. And just because somebody doesn't know or doesn't have an idea of what caused something or who's responsible for something or what's responsible for something does not automatically make the opposite position correct. You, Frank, still have to support the idea that your mysterious suspect A actually committed the murder, while the atheist detective can still say, I don't think so because your evidence doesn't support your conclusion. And then you're going to sit there and be like, okay, well then who did it? And the atheist detective would be like, I don't know who fucking did it. I mean, I don't have enough evidence here. I haven't investigated it. We just came upon this scene there, Frank. And then Frank's like, I guess the suspect there. Go wrap him up, put him in a paddy wagon, take him on down, charge his ass. Fuck him. You would be the worst fucking detective ever, Frank.
So what I'm saying is that atheists need to explain from an atheistic perspective, why is there a universe at all? Why is it fine-tuned? Where do the objective moral laws come from? Where does life come from? Where do the laws of logic come from? What about the Old Testament prophecies and Jesus rising from the dead and consciousness and all these other aspects of reality that I think everybody has the burden of proof to explain no matter what position they come from?
Wait, why do atheists have a burden of proof to prove that, to prove something about those things? Like any of those things. I don't see we're not making a positive claim about any of those things. In fact, you're the one who is suggesting that God did it, and therefore you have to provide the proof to support your conclusion that God did it. If your proof doesn't actually prove that God did it, then I don't have to have an alternate position other than, well, your position's a dipshit position to have because your proof doesn't actually prove what you're saying. I don't have to offer up any alternative idea for how things happened. And just because I can't do that, like I've said before, does not automatically make you correct there, Frank. So, like for the resurrection of Jesus, you propose that Jesus actually resurrected because some book says so. I can show you, and I've done several times here on this channel, I've got a whole playlist called Resurrection Refuted, where I go through the different pieces of evidence for the supposed resurrection, and I show how the evidence doesn't actually support the resurrection as happening. That doesn't mean that I have to explain, like, why Jesus was seen after he was alive. I don't think that he was. Or that people were hallucinating. I don't have to present a definitive alternative answer for it. I can have multiple different things that debunks your whole idea. If all of these other things are also equally possible, then there's no way that yours is 100% correct. Going back to his whole murder scene thing, it's still quite possible that suspect A is the actual murderer in that situation. Just like with the God debate, it's very possible that God could exist. I've never suggested that God can't exist or definitely does not exist, nor have most atheists. But Frank, as well as other apologists and Christians out there, feel like the Christian position on God is the default position, and they think that atheists have to definitively prove them wrong with precise alternative explanations, when that's not the case. I don't know is a perfectly reasonable answer. And just because you don't have a specific alternative explanation does not mean that they are automatically correct. So I hope you heathens have enjoyed this today. If you will, please go down below, let me know what you thought about Frank's video. Do you think that he has a good point here, or do you think that he's kind of being a dipshit? Let me know in the comments below. While you're down there, make sure you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.